Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. We appreciate your testimony as well. I must say I'm getting a little car sick looking at Congressman Rice and what's going on out the window. But we do have Dr. Mona back. This is an effort by Dan Kilby to try and build suspense for this testimony. I think it's working, Doctor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My sincere apologies. I wish I could have said that I did that on purpose to support our broadband efforts and the need to invest in broadband infrastructure, but it was not done on purpose. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, good. Just want to make sure. All right. So thank you, Congressman Kilby. Thank you for that kind welcome. Congressman Kilby's North Star has always been the best interest and the greatest potential of our children. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and everybody else that's part of this committee. Infrastructure is a critical topic, as you've all said, and I am pleased that the subcommittee is voting today's hearing fit, especially as it relates to drinking water. And one of the advantages of doing this virtually, and definitely not the internet connection, but I get to share things with you that I couldn't probably bring to the Capitol. This right here is a lead pipe, and I'm so glad my video works. In Flint's history, before the water crisis, lead pipes were probably best known for feeding union organizers, especially during our historic sit-down strike. And sadly, as we've learned firsthand in Flint, there's more than one way to hurt people with lead pipes. My friend Harold Harrington gave me this pipe a couple days ago. Harold is a Flint master plumber, a member of United Association UA 370, which is the local union of plumbers and pipe fitters. Harold and his colleagues have been working tirelessly to replace Flint pipes. This is actually the first pipe that was replaced in Flint. And I think you can appreciate that our pipes are like straws. You see that? They're just like drinking water straws. But in Flint and in cities across this country, these straws are made of a poison with no safe level, a poison that erodes cognition and twists behavior and can forever alter the trajectory of children. And you never really know when a piece of that poison is going to come off our straws and go into our drinking water and ultimately into the bodies of our children. And I want to show you another lead pipe. This is another lead pipe that came from the home of Oscar and Elizabeth Brown. In the 1950s, the Browns moved from Mississippi plant, and they lived in Flint, raising and nurturing generations of their family. Their entire family, including Dana, their great-grandson, drank water from this lead pipe. And to this day, my heart breaks knowing that lead-poisoned water was filling baby bottles and sippy cups. Dana has had health problems, including seizures, and I wish there was something as a pediatrician that I could prescribe to take away what happened in Flint. But when it comes to lead, the only cure is prevention. Our decades-long inaction to invest in infrastructure failed the children of Flint. But Flint's crisis was not the first, the last, or the worst. The U.S. was stubbornly slow to respect science and didn't restrict the use of lead pipes until 1986. And we don't even know, but we think there's about 9 million lead lines in the country. And we're almost done replacing our lead pipes in Flint, and so is another post-crisis city, Newark, New Jersey. Utilizing the expertise of highly skilled plumbers and pipe fitters like Harold, Flint and Newark are doing this critical infrastructure work faster than ever before. And as a pediatrician, I would be remiss if I did not say that the ill effects of poverty and income inequality inequity also manifests in the bodies and in the blunted potential of children. So it is a public health priority that our pipes are replaced by men and women in union jobs making a living wage. But it shouldn't take crises to reactively ensure safe drinking water or living wage jobs. I fully support President Biden's plan to remove 100% of our lead pipes as quickly as possible. And as we strive to eliminate inequities and implement environmental justice and anti-racist policies, water infrastructure work, especially lead pipe work, should be prioritized in historically disadvantaged communities. These investments are not just about pipes and plumbing, they are about people and our potential to right historic wrongs. And some will argue about the cost, but the cost of inaction is unaffordable. The economic cost of lead exposure includes lost productivity and earnings, and greater health care, mental health, criminal justice, and special education costs. For every lead pipe replaced, there is a 33% societal return on investment. It makes economic sense. And I spoke a lot about lead, and as Congressman Kildee knows, I could probably go on for hours, but I also want to share that our overall water infrastructure is outdated, it is fragile, and also a threat to our public health. From addressing emerging contaminants like the forever chemicals, the PFAS chemicals, to ensuring safe drinking water during extreme weather conditions, investments in infrastructure are critical for our global competitiveness. In closing, I want to come back to this lead pipe, this toxic straw, right? This pipe and the millions like it belong down the street at the Smithsonian. I look forward to the museum exhibits and the history books showcasing that time when the leaders of our great nation, you guys, boldly took action to invest not only in our drinking water infrastructure, but also in the foundation of our nation's greatest and most valuable resource, our children. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mona. It was well worth waiting for. I think that's compelling that the only cure is prevention. I will just have one question because I want to make sure my colleagues have an opportunity to deal with this amazing series of panelists. But I would like to just direct it to President Sharp, if I could. You highlight in your testimony the substandard infrastructure in Indian country and how these infrastructure disparities dramatically increase the vulnerability of American Indians and Alaskan Natives during the COVID-19 pandemic. You highlight some of the funding inequities, which I thought was really compelling. But I wondered if you could just focus for a moment on what we should be doing to support and amplify Native communities' efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change in our country and your sense of infrastructure priorities for Indian country.
Excellent question. I really appreciate the question on climate change. Some of the significant things that I think would be very helpful is including tribal nations at the table at all levels. Right now, we actively engage in climate policy at the local, national, regional, and international levels. And I think having an opportunity to see from our perspective what it means to envision how we can best recover and confront the impacts of climate change. We need to not only focus on new and emerging science and technology, but also the thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom and traditional ecological knowledge that we do possess. And direct investments in tribal nation infrastructure in every sector is going to help only strengthen us in ensure that we play our part in providing the economic recovery and success that the United States also envisions.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point about millennia of experience with Native people and how to rebalance that equation. I appreciate your testimony. As I say, let me just turn now so that other committee members have an opportunity. Congressman Buchanan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a critical and timely hearing, and I want to appreciate, because we work on a bunch of things together, we want to do everything we can to work together on a bipartisan basis. Let me mention Mr. Anderson. I've watched Paul, his incredible leadership. He's done an incredible job at the port. As he mentioned, 85,000 jobs, I think it was. It's unbelievable. But I wanted to touch on Mr. Anderson. As we look to the government, federal government, with all this spending, one of the things I think we have to be open-minded to is public-private partnerships. And you mentioned Big Bend Canal, widening that, expanding that. I know it's expensive, but talk a little bit about public-private partnerships and how you put that together.
Again, thank you, Ranking Member Buchanan, for having me today and inviting me to testify. Private-public partnerships have began with really the strategic location of our port and identifying companies that had an interest in expanding their infrastructure and supporting their customers. The ones that I mentioned both have very sustainable benefits to them, and in both cases, private equity partners invested hundreds of millions of dollars, and we matched those with revenue generated both by the port as well as some federal and state dollars. So we've not only brought together a private sector and partner, we've been able to work very closely with our state and federal partners to truly make this a winning strategy for investment in our port. And in many cases, it's making up, like the Big Bend, where we had Tico Energy and Mosaic. I think this was unprecedented, where private companies were investing in dredging a federal approved channel. So we're looking for additional opportunities to do this, and it's always another way to find infrastructure funding for our port.
Hey, Paul, I've got about 3 minutes and 2 questions extra. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of trade agreements like USMCA and us being aggressive on that front, whether it's Central and South America or European friends? Because I know you're one of the closest, not the closest ports to the Panama Canal. Maybe just touch on that quickly about the significance of trade agreements.
The USMCA is vital. Our 3 largest trading partners are Brazil, Mexico, and Canada. And it's really critical that our trading partners and the United States have clear regulatory guidance on our trade, as well as what the benefits are to those trading partners. And I believe it's still early in the process for seeing benchmarking benefits, but we're definitely seeing those. We just recently, Mario Cordera, my friend and colleague, mentioned marine highways. We have a marine highway from Texas to Tampa, utilizing that, and that's a cargo coming from Mexico into Texas, and then using a barge instead of using trucks, and that is a direct benefit of the USMCA.
Let me ask you the last question. In terms of, I think you mentioned to me you were the first port dedicated to an environmental program, reducing air emissions, reducing waste, conserving energy. Maybe you could talk about that. I think you're one of the ports a leader, or the first port really to be that focused on environmental sensitive issues.
Well, I believe all ports are focused on environmental sustainability and bringing balance to what we do for consumers and American citizens. We have world-class bird nesting program with Audubon Society. We just last week had a port cleanup of trash, marine trash that's not from the port, but from surrounding communities. Over 500 volunteers removed 10 tons of trash from mangroves and other surrounding areas. And we have electrification of a lot of our equipment. And as well, we've installed digital infrastructure, which we feel is not only more efficient, it's also sustainable in the event of hurricane and other weather-related events.
Well, thank you, Paul. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan. Congressman Kind.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. And Mr. Chairman, first of all, thanks for your tremendous leadership through the years and trying to get us rallied in a bipartisan fashion for a major infrastructure reinvestment plan for our country. So we can start rebuilding America, rebuilding Wisconsin, rebuilding Oregon the way we need to. First, a quick story, Mr. Chairman, before I ask a question. I got up early in the morning, as I usually do, to run the city streets of my hometown in La Crosse. Today, it took me twice as long to complete the route because everyone who saw me out there were stopping me to talk to me about this pothole here or this road that needed attention there, this bridge that we've been putting off for too long, the water system that needs attention. So the demand is out there, and the time couldn't be more perfect coming out of the coronavirus for us to be focused on this. And I commend all the witnesses for your excellent testimony here today. But let me start with you, Dr. Turner Lee. You mentioned Mr. Clyburn, and I've been participating with him in a national broadband task force. You know, this virus has really highlighted the digital divide like never before and the work ahead of us. Yes, we have to get good mapping to see where the shortfalls occur. Yes, we have to do a better job of understanding the different internet speeds, which is crucial as well. But my question to you is, we're going to need to partner, leverage public funds with the private sector. How do we get the private companies being rewarded these payments, the contracts, to do what they say they're going to do, rather than picking up and leaving, which happened in one of my communities in the northern part of my district recently, or stretching it out and taking 2 or 3 times as long? What type of oversight do you think we're going to need to do with the private sector on broadband build-out?
Thank you, Representative. I appreciate that question in particular, because as you know, with universal service, it's always been guided by a return on investment model. So we have to change that formula, because what the pandemic has demonstrated is there is a return on investment for everyone, and particularly for those that experience high rates of systemic inequality or are geographically isolated. So I do agree with you that we have to change the frame, right? We've got to change the equation so that broadband access is not about market-based outcomes, but rather it's about creating an ecosystem where everybody can participate, particularly if we're going to reach 100% penetration. With that being the case, I do think Mr. Clyburn's bill on the adoption of an agency is really interesting, right? Because it places within the control, potentially under commerce, an agency that is able to look at the metrics and the strategies for actually putting these solutions out there. The reason I went with the Tech New Deal, Congressman, was because I feel like there's several Post-it notes out there and they're not guided under one frame. And so I think it's important for us to also evaluate, not just because, waiting for the map to happen, but to evaluate where do we need to put these investments where we know it's going to have a duplicative investment in terms of the quality of life for residents, as well as the type of entrepreneurship and enterprise development that we want to see. So until we, again, go back and change those models in which we've looked at how we wholesale investment, until we change the preference of certain technologies and become more technology agnostic, and allow us to bring in different technologies that may work for smaller communities versus larger communities. And until we have an agency that is guided by these public-private sector partnerships and bring in civil society organizations, we're going to build a lot, but we may not have the demand that we need. And so to your point, I'm arguing, let's change these contribution guidelines. Let's bring a whole hands-on-deck strategy, and then let's focus on use cases. Maybe we need something like a No Child Left Offline initiative to just focus school leaders to close that divide. And so thinking about that may get to what you're talking about.
Thank you for that response. And for the committee's information, we just had a great hearing in the Health Subcommittee too about telehealth and the importance of broadband expansion and closing the divide. I mean, Mr. Chairman, before my time, I'd be remiss as the representative with more miles on the Mississippi River than anyone else, that I hope as we move forward, we're also paying attention to the inland waterway infrastructure needs. I've got an aging lock and dam system up and down the Mississippi in the 1930s. It's being held by tape and bubble gum right now. Crucial route for exports, especially for advanced manufactured products, agriculture products here as well. And Ms. Sharp, I know we're running out of time and we won't be able to get into it, but I do draw your attention to my Tribal Tax and Investment Reform Act. We're hoping to reintroduce that in a bipartisan basis, bringing parity to tax treatment with tribal governments throughout the country, along with local governments. And I think that too will help deal.
Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. Yeah, clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. Yeah, We clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. It is Thursday, April 29th, 2021. And today, this day, I want to drive a stake through the heart of neoliberal framing and corporate media spin. President Joe Biden gave a good speech last night.
Look, in conclusion, as we gather here tonight, the image of a violent mob assaulting this Capitol, desecrating our democracy, remain vivid in all our minds. Lives were put at risk, many of your lives. Lives were lost. Extraordinary courage was summoned. The insurrection was an existential crisis, a test of whether our democracy could survive, and it did. But the struggle is far from over. The question of whether our democracy will long endure is both ancient and urgent. As old as our republic, still vital today. Can our democracy deliver on its promise that all of us, created equal in the image of God, had a chance to lead lives of dignity, respect, and possibility? Can our democracy deliver the most pressing needs of our people? Can our democracy overcome the lies, anger, hate, and fears that have pulled us apart? America's adversaries, the autocrats of the world, are betting we can't. And I promise you they're betting we can't. They believe we're too full of anger and division and rage. They look at the images of the mob that assaulted the Capitol as proof that the sun is setting on American democracy. But they're wrong. You know it, I know it. But we have to prove them wrong. We have to prove democracy still works, that our government still works, and we can deliver for our people.
So what did corporate media and the punditry class do with this speech? Frank Luntz.
This is the most class-oriented speech that I've heard in a long time. It does harken back to Barack Obama 10 years ago. And there's very much in this speech that indicates that the era of big government is back.
Okay, that was the soundbite. The era of big government is back. Okay, you might expect that from Frank Luntz, who you just heard there. He is a Republican pollster trying to frame things in a different way, in a way that will help his clients. But what about National Public Radio? Interesting. Big government is back, and 3 other takeaways from Biden's address to Congress. Or how about this headline on CNN? The era of big government is back with a vengeance. Okay, so what does that headline even mean? Big government is back with a vengeance. Is this like the Marvel comic universe version of politics? Vengeance against whom? For what? This isn't all that of what Biden said. He said that democracy has to demonstrate that it can deliver for the people. But with barely breath and certainly not much of a thought, we were plunged right back into a tired trope that Ronald Reagan introduced and a series of Democratic presidents then enabled. The idea that government, our government, is the problem. The idea that the era of big government is over. This is not about big government or small government. It is about government doing what it should be doing to make lives better. Saying that the era of big government is back is framing the whole debate the way that the neoliberals, the Republicans, and the enemies of working people wanted it framed. We are captives to a soundbite. Ronald Reagan is still winning. So to quote Nancy Reagan, just say no. Don't buy this framing. It is the enemy of what we are fighting for. This is not a fight over the size of government. I don't care what size the government is. I care what the government does for the people who are hurting. Because you know what? I'm going to guess that all the people who hate the government love the size of those defense contracts. That's a lot of the government. So there are a lot of working people in this country and around the world right now who are hurting. And so that is why I care what the government does for those working people. And President Biden has put forward plans to help them. You know, surprisingly so. I think he's surprised a lot of folks, but I don't think he has a choice. If you don't like his plans, go ahead and say so. If you appreciate his goals but don't think this will work, go ahead and say so. If you think taxes to pay for this will do more harm than good, then just say that. I will take you on each time, but it is a meaningful debate. What is not meaningful is this phony trope about big government. As progressives, we can't let the future of our country get reduced to a soundbite about the era of big government being back with a vengeance. It's shallow, it's false, it isn't the debate the country needs. It's actually not the debate the country is having. The debate we need is how to do more. How do we help people climb out of the hole the last 30, 40 years has thrown them into? That is what we need to be debating. Enough. All right, speaking of Reagan era, we have John Nichols on. I think he was alive during the Reagan era. Pretty sure I was. No, but he's on to talk about Walter Mondale, who just passed away. The legacy of Walter Mondale, of course, you know, an end of a certain sort of liberal era has ended with Walter Mondale passing away. We're going to talk about that with him. And later we have Arun Chaudhary, the new host of the committee show, which we'll talk about, and Representative Rabb from Northwest Philly. They're going to be talking about today's news, Arun's new show. I don't know. We're just gonna chat away, chatters, chat. That's what's gonna happen. All right, we will be right back. Our next guest does not need an introduction because he's one of our favorite guests. I love when he comes out with something outside of the norm because as a result, you're the only guest who can talk about it. The legacy of, so many people had think pieces on Walter Mondale. And I gotta say, like, you just offer a different perspective. And I think for this moment specifically, as progressives, as someone who lives in Wisconsin, you know, land of populists and Koch brothers, there's a unique take. Of course, I'm talking about John Nichols. John Nichols is the national affairs correspondent for The Nation. He is the author of The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, the enduring legacy of Henry Wallace's anti-fascist, anti-racist politics. But we're going to talk about another anti-racist, Walter Mondale. You wrote a piece in The Nation, Walter Mondale's decades-long crusade for fair housing and the full promise of civil rights. This is about, to the end of his life, as it says here, Mondale waged the battle against segregation. He had joined as the sponsor of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. John, thanks for joining us.
It's an honor to be with you, of course, Nomiki, and I'm delighted that you want to talk about this. In fact, I must say I'm rather surprised that my little story about Walter Mondale got as much attention as it did. And I think it was because so many people wrote about him in the cliched, kind of predictable, oh, he was vice president, and he was the Democratic nominee for president, and he was. And then they kind of, that was about it. And the truth is that the greatest story of Walter Mondale had very little to do with his vice presidency and very little to do with his candidacy for president. It was really that as a very young man from a tiny town in Minnesota, who, kind of really clawed his way up, worked his way up, whatever the right term is, into politics, made a commitment to civil rights and particularly to open housing that he never abandoned. The day he died, he literally in the last, months of his life, the last weeks of his life, was still advocating for civil rights, for open housing, and most notably for everything that extended from that, including a very conscious focus on systemic racism.
So let's rewind just a little bit because for the youngsters out there who maybe
we all
were
like to think of ourselves, yeah.
For those of us who were not cognizant of Walter Mondale, maybe ever because we weren't alive. I was. I'm just saying, those of us. It's not me at all. Let's just talk about the more cliche stuff first. The political. Let's get the fundamentals and then get into the nitty gritty. So, what era? How did he come up? You mentioned Minnesota, small town, clawing his way up. What is the early story of Walter Mondale, and how does that brush up against, the civil rights era specifically?
Yeah, I mean, Walter Mondale grew up in a place that was about as white as it could get. I mean, that's the important thing to understand. He was in the upper Midwest in a small town, son of a pastor, grew up in a pretty religious family, but as in much of the populist upper Midwest of those days, a very, very different time than now. But the populous upper Midwest of those days, people who lived in small towns tended to think that corporate power and a lot of what happened, in New York or in Washington didn't care about them, that they weren't particularly well represented. And so that's what fed into populism. And Mondale's parents were supporters of Robert M. La Follette and the progressive movement. And in North Dakota, or in the neighboring state of North Dakota, the Nonpartisan League, in Minnesota, the Farmer Labor Party. And so you had all these independent third parties that really were very radical. And their radicalism tended to be economic, but along the way, they took in a commitment to a broad democracy. And that made most of them very committed to civil rights. They were also happened to be very, very anti-war, another element of it. And so when Mondale came up, he came up in an incredibly intense moment in Minnesota politics when the Farmer Labor Party was aligning with the Democrats. The Farmer Labor Party had a huge left-wing component, including a communist component within it, certainly a lot of socialists. The Democrats were not, they were anti-communist, but because of this radicalism that was there, they were a much more radical Democratic Party than most around the country. And to give you one quick historical note, in 1948, the leader of the drive for a civil rights plank in the Democratic platform, or the National Democratic Party's platform, this is a breakthrough thing, first time they really made this commitment, was Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. And it was in that same year that Walter Mondale met Humphrey and committed, if you will, as a very young man, to this journey, to this deep, deep commitment to civil rights and to a very liberal vision for America.
Was that a trend during that era that you'd find a couple of populists, anti-war populists, who ended up having maybe it was less political. There were fewer political dynamics, at least locally, in terms of stepping out in favor of radical civil rights platforms, because it didn't, if you're coming out of New York, there are all these dynamics, you have to weigh out, these different situations, you have different communities that you need to respond to. There's unions, there's trades, it's all this stuff that but if you're in a place like Vermont with Bernie Sanders, like Minnesota, where it's a seemingly very white population, there's less at stake to step out and be courageous.
I think that you make a really good point. And sociologists will tell you that that in the history of this country, there have been a lot of cases where people said great things, right? And looked to be very, very courageous. But in fact, it was kind of easier, right? That they came from a place or they came from a circumstance where you could take a bold stand and you didn't face necessarily that much of a political cost. And there's truth in that. Certainly, I think the most courageous advocates for civil rights are people like, I think it's Charles Weltner out of Atlanta, Georgia, the former congressman who in 1966, sitting Democratic congressman who had voted for civil rights legislation coming out of Atlanta, was going to be forced to run on a ticket with Lester Maddox, a segregationist. And in that state, they had a loyalty oath. And the congressman quit the race and quit his seat. He gave up his career.
Wow.
Run on a ticket with a segregationist. So those are, without a doubt, those are people that we hold up as incredibly courageous. There's simply no question of that. But I will, I'll give you a twist on Mondale here as well.
Yeah.
When Mondale got to the United States Senate and he was appointed to replace Humphrey, and then came in as he was elected in 1966. 1966 was the year of backlash in America.
Yeah.
And it was an ugly, ugly moment in American history. The Civil Rights Act had been passed. The Voting Rights Act had been passed. And a lot of people say, oh, well, we're on the march here. But in fact, in that 1966 election, there was a big pushback against civil rights and against the advances of the movement. You saw segregationists winning in a lot of southern states, but you also saw in a lot of northern and western states, candidates stepping up and saying, this is going too far. One of them was Ronald Reagan. He was elected in California, actually speaking in favor of segregated housing.
I'm shocked.
I know, I'm shocking. And he said,
he used to be a Democrat, though. What are you talking about?
But the interesting thing about Reagan was he said, I don't believe in it myself, but I don't think we should make people desegregate. I don't think we should have, he opposed open housing legislation. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why Reagan got elected governor of California in 1966. And he wasn't alone. Across the country, this was the big boom thing. So they came back in 1966 into that next Congress, controlled by the Democrats, but with a lot of Southern Democrats who were segregationists, a lot of Republicans who had come in on this backlash wave. And they had a problem because the Civil Rights Act did, while it was terrific in a lot of ways, didn't include open housing. And so at this fundamental issue, this question of, can you live where you want to live? Can you live where you can buy a house or rent an apartment? Was unaddressed. And it needed to be addressed. Lyndon Johnson knew it needed to be addressed. Humphrey knew it needed to be addressed. Civil rights leaders who had been passionately advocating it knew that it needed to be addressed. It was 1966, 67 there that Dr. King was coming north. And he was saying, yeah, we've had some progress in the South, but now we have to talk about segregated northern cities, cities like Chicago, cities like Minneapolis in Minnesota. And this became a real tension point in Congress, and no senior Democrat wanted to take the open housing legislation. No one would sign on.
None of them, even the ones from interesting. So
it wasn't that they were all opposed to it.
Yeah,
they didn't want to step out and be, I'm gonna be the leader for open housing, because they had just seen Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's dad, a popular governor of California, get beat in California, the supposedly hippie liberal state, by Ronald Reagan running against open housing. And so there were a lot of people that were really scared to step up. And Lyndon Johnson looked around the Senate and he found the youngest member, or I think the youngest member at the time, this new kid, he was still in his 30s, from Minnesota, Walter Mondale.
Unreal.
And he said to Mondale, here you are, brand new senator, basically. Would you take the lead on open housing?
Ossoff.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, not too much older.
Or young Biden.
Exactly. And so he went to Mondale, and Mondale, not stupid. He had grown up in politics. He'd been in it, since he was a kid. He knew what he was being asked. He knew that there was some political risk here. And this is where we come full circle on your question about where courage comes in. He knew there was some political risk, but he was absolutely committed to civil rights. There was no question. He knew that open housing, as he spoke often, open housing was the key to so many other things, because if people could move to live where they wanted to live, then you could start to really speak about desegregating neighborhoods, desegregating schools, desegregating business areas.
Right.
There was so much that extended from it. It was really at the heart of the matter. Now, this open housing legislation was being opposed by the realtors.
There we go. This is my next question. Yeah, you know where I'm going with
Corporate
this.
interests coming
Yep,
in.
yep.
All home builders didn't like it. A lot of Democrats didn't like it. There were actually Democrats saying, well, come on, that's going too far, right? We're for civil rights as long as it's telling George Wallace to get out of the schoolhouse door. But when you're actually saying we're going to desegregate
Structural.
Boston or Chicago, that's bringing it close to home. And Mondale found one ally in the initial stages, a very key ally, and that was Ed Brooke, a Republican senator from Massachusetts, the first African-American senator elected since Reconstruction.
Didn't he also have an affair with Barbara Walters? Sorry, side note.
There's talk of that, but we're
No,
not
she admitted it. She admitted it. I know that's off topic. Sorry.
We're not
Just
about gossip here.
last time I heard of that, I haven't heard the name in a while, and then
Ed Brooke was a remarkable figure. He was a very liberal Republican, a courageous Republican who remarkably got elected in that 1966 year, beating back backlash politics. And the interesting thing was that Mondale and Brooke knew each other. They had both been state attorneys general.
Oh, interesting.
And they were both about the same age, and they both knew that this thing had to move. Now, Brooke was in the minority. He was a Republican in a Democratic-controlled Senate. So Mondale had to take the lead, but it really was the two of them together. And they came back at this again and again, and they pushed it, and they built the coalition for it. But they got it to a point in the Senate where they actually got to a majority. But they couldn't get the House to move on it because Southern segregationists controlled the rules committees and much of the structure of the House. And the Republicans and the Southern segregationists in the House were preventing it from moving forward. April 4, 1968, Dr. King is assassinated in Memphis. The country is, it's a terrible moment for America. There's urban unrest everywhere. And the next day, Walter Mondale went to the floor of the Senate, and he said, look, if we are going to keep this country together at this point, we have to complete the mission of civil rights. He gave one of the most passionate addresses of his life. And he began to work with Senate members and House members to try and break this bill free. And in an incredible fury of activity over a period of a week, they got the House committee chairs to give up. They got a couple of key Republicans to move over, thanks to Brooke as well as Mondale. They got the Senate to commit to an alliance with the House on it. And they had the open housing bill on Lyndon Johnson's desk 1 week after Dr. King was killed. It was an incredible thing, which probably could not have happened at any other point in, because you're coming on to the Nixon era and Southern strategies and all that. And so in that key moment, Walter Mondale and Ed Brooke broke the barriers. They broke it open. They got the law passed. And this was at a time when even Bobby Kennedy and people like that were not stepping up for this. But they did at this moment. They recognized it was something they had to do. And so incredibly, Mondale could have rested on his laurels then and said, well, I did something good and I'll get my little place in the history books. No, Walter Mondale then kept going back to the Congress, every Congress, to get the funding for it, the funding to investigate discrimination, the funding to pay for housing development. And when he became vice president, he wrestled with the Carter administration on it. As a presidential candidate, he talked about it and made it central to what he did. In fact, that was one of the reasons why the Democratic Leadership Council and people like that were so unsettled by Walter Mondale, because he seemed to be so committed to this multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition and bringing labor in as well. But the closing part of the story, right, on this element of it is that when he was no longer vice president, when he was no longer a presidential candidate or anything like that, he never let go. There were essays he wrote, forums he participated in, documentaries that he did, well into just recent years. Even as he got into his 90s, he still made his deep, long commitment to open housing. And he challenged Democratic and Republican presidents on it. And he also recognized its connection to systemic racism, to the extent that last summer in Minneapolis, when George Floyd was killed, murdered, and when there were big demonstrations, Minneapolis's political elites were divided on that. They didn't quite know, what to do, because their city itself was, look, there were riots, there was challenges and stuff like that. And you saw a lot of you saw great leadership from people like Ilhan Omar and some others, but you also saw caution on the part of a lot of folks. Walter Mondale wrote an essay for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune in which he said, look, civil rights is a journey. Open housing is a journey. All of this is a journey. And we have been too long without, taking the next steps we need to do to address systemic racism. And so he said, the people who are in the streets here in Minneapolis, I thank you.
Well, think about it. It's like, as you're telling the story of 1968, so many heroes and advocates and martyrs got attention, shook the world, but they were so prevalent. They were so well known, right? There was an emotional attachment to them. And here we are, how many years later? 60 years later, almost 60 years later, 55 years later. And the power of this communication, the internet, whatever it is, being able to have cell phone footage, as much as it's a journey and as much as it's been a slow journey and there has not been fair justice in so many ways, it is fascinating that now the individual story of people that we don't personally know are connecting with a broader audience. And so the way that the world was shook in the last year because of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, so many others. I mean, this has been going on for, since camera footage has been released, that folks are now having kind of like the same reaction to a person that they didn't know as they did to MLK. And so there's something, I don't know.
Yeah, I think
special about that.
I think the point that you're making is a key one here. And obviously, the assassination of Dr. King was so jarring to the whole nation. And it was also at a different time, at a time when this country actually did move when things happened, right? You had something and you said, wow, well, let's pass some open housing legislation. Whereas now we have so many barriers in our politics to it. And it's like, I've interviewed Mondale over the years and saw him in many, many settings. One of the things that he always focused on, and I think it's important for us too as well, is that there's always a movement there. You talk about a former vice president, Mondale had privilege, he had prominence in that. And it happened that this was a passion of his. But he, as he did in last year, when he thanked the folks who were in the streets, he recognized that there was this long journey never ended. There were always people who were stepping up and trying to get the issues into focus. These were the civil rights campaigners who went south in the 1940s, not the 1960s, but the 1940s. These were the folks who organized for fair housing in northern cities at great risk in places like Boston and Chicago and other spots. And Mondale recognized that he was lucky to be a part of that movement, that he resisted, and I think there was a certain Midwestern modesty. He resisted the hero image, right? Or that he was somehow.
Well, he's also a white man working with a civil rights. I mean, you can't be unless you're the president signing the Civil Rights Act, it's very hard to be the hero in comparison to people who are literally getting lynched.
That's exactly right. And that's something, but to his credit, there were many of the people who were prominent in those days who didn't seem to recognize that or who accepted the
Name some names. Come on. They're all dead now.
No. Well, I think it was, I think you saw a tremendous number of prominent Democrats who stepped up and who frankly weren't as courageous and who, in hindsight, they get credit simply because they were Democrats. And now the Democrats and Republicans have divided so much. Mm-hmm. And what people lose sight of is that there were deep divisions within the Democratic Party about whether to commit fully to fighting racism, to being anti-racist. And Mondale, the interesting thing is, when I wrote about this, I was struck by how many people responded to it, and how many people didn't know it. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to go so far as to say that Mondale was fine with that, but it wasn't to some extent an extension of the fact that he kept pushing on these issues, but he didn't necessarily go out of his way to say, oh, I'm this great guy. He would appear, and there were forums he appeared at, at kind of down to the neighborhood level as a former vice president. That's amazing. Documentaries and things he made for fair housing groups. There wasn't the celebrity game with him. It was
a different era too.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. But there is something to be said about when you say this moment, before the DLC started to take hold, before Nixon, I think what's really kind of amazing about this story in particular is being a populist, a white male populist from the upper Midwest, in a moment when monopoly lobbying style politics that we live in now and all the DLC and the neoliberalism take over the Democratic Party, all that stuff hadn't happened. So there was just like this, I mean, even Johnson, like when you're talking about Johnson finding him, oh, can we imagine Biden maybe calling up Joe Manchin or John Ossoff or whatever? And like, I mean, John Ossoff isn't in a position where he needs to carry a bill. First off, find a bill that Biden can't, that he wants to introduce that no senators were like willing to introduce. Doesn't exist, at least something that's more progressive.
Well, or go out and determine to do it. And I think
the determination, the leadership.
Your point is well made. And let me give you just a little bit of maybe insight on this thing, that the Democratic Party was so different, despite its divisions within it, right? There were so many touchstones within the Democratic Party to be pro-labor, right? To be strongly pro-labor, to be in favor of civil rights, although some were not as courageous as others, and a host of other commitments. And that in 1984, because here we're talking very positively about Walter Mondale, and I think appropriately so. But in 1984, I was a young person who was very committed to the movement against apartheid and a host of other issues. I thought Mondale was, he's a very typical Democrat. I was a supporter that year of Jesse Jackson. And I was enthusiastic about Jesse Jackson's candidacy as I was in '88. And so, but I think that's not to diminish Mondale. It's to speak about the change in the party, right? That a guy who, to a young activist or somebody young person, was just not that big a deal, right? He's a kind of a mainstream Democrat. I'm more interested in this this change politics that Reverend Jesse Jackson was bringing to the moment. Just as I think today a lot of young people are very excited about Bernie Sanders as opposed to Joe Biden. Now, the fascinating thing on it is that in hindsight, we look back at Mondale and we say, wow, a life well lived. There's quite a few things he did that were good. There are things I'd be critical of, and we could talk about that. But the fact is, this long journey on fair housing to the end of his life, to the point where when he passed, Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, the Congresswoman from Minneapolis, put out these really laudatory statements about Walter Mondale, because they knew, right? They knew he had been there through this. He had been there through this long journey, and yet, in his moment when he ran for president, he seemed more of a typical Democrat.
Is that because he was attached to the Carter administration, though?
To some extent, remember, he was Carter's liberal, right?
Of course.
When Carter ran, he needed a liberal running mate, and Mondale serve that role. But no, the party changed radically. And it's only now beginning to kind of come back, I think, to a more, frankly, just a more realistic place.
So optimistic.
I'm somewhat optimistic. I mean,
listen.
Biden gave a better speech last night than I expected.
He did, yes. Yeah. That was our opening.
Yeah.
And then NPR was like, the era of big government is back with a vengeance. It's like, oh, Jesus Christ.
Let's hope.
Well, but it, like, my opening was all about how we have to attach ourselves to these right-wing, like Reagan-esque talking points. And, the reality is that like the majority of people under 50 were old enough to even be brainwashed by that community. It's just a, yeah.
But Nomiki, let's talk for a moment about that brainwashing if we can, because that's the interesting thing is only in hindsight do we begin to realize what happened to the Democratic Party. Because in 1984, Walter Mondale was the Democratic nominee for president of the United States. He beat Gary Hart and Jesse Jackson for the nomination in a relatively intense primary process. He, instead of saying, oh, well, I beat this young guy, I beat the activist guy, I'm going to be the very mainstream guy. He said, no. I want these people. I want to pull this all together. And he ran for president of the United States, the Democratic nominee, with a deep commitment to economic and social and racial justice, a questioning of America's foreign policies, not as much questioning as I would have liked. But, he ran as a liberal and he got beat. I mean, he got beat badly. I mean, Reagan, swept to power. But the fact of the matter is that instead of saying, okay, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, right? The elites in the Democratic Party, the economic elites in the Democratic Party said, never again. We're never going to run, a liberal campaign for the presidency of the United States. We're going to form the Democratic Leadership Council. We are going to bring bigger money into the Democratic Party, and we are going to move this party to the center, even the center right. We are going to make it a corporate-friendly political party. And the truth of the matter is that after that 1984 campaign, you saw what they did to McGovern, right? They were like, oh, we can't be too anti-war or we'll get beat like McGovern, just because that was one election, right? Or we can't be too, pro-labor because we'll get beat like Mondale. Well, think if the conservatives had done that. They said, well, we can't be conservative because Barry Goldwater got beat, or we can't be conservative because Ronald Reagan didn't win the nomination in 1976. Conservatives didn't do that. Republicans didn't do that. They said, okay, we gotta rework this a little. We gotta calculate a little more, but there are certain principles that we believe in and we're not gonna abandon them. Well, the Democrats in the 80s, late 80s and 90s chose to abandon. And the reality was that they ended up with a situation where they got power, right? And then what did they do? They undid New Deal laws. In case of Clinton, they literally undid, welfare programs. I mean, they signed the Defense of Marriage Act. You know what I mean? These were Democrats,
and it was so interesting.
A center right group.
The old Cuomo line. You campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. They were. The excuses of that time, and I hate to say this because we have like only a couple minutes left, but the excuses at that time were very much like, well, we're doing it because we want to win elections. Well, the reality was, and that, as you know, I don't have to tell you, we lost Congress for the first time in 30 years as a result of this. And then under Obama, we lost 1,200 seats. I'm sorry, what part of your strategy of like devastating this country, wrecking it, taking a wrecking ball of this country to racist economic austerity, taking on unions, none of those things actually won the elections, other than maybe a presidency every couple of cycles when the Republicans had gone too far. I'm of the position that I don't think it was an actual strategy it was an excuse. So when I hear Elaine Kamarck, Google her if you don't know who she is, not you, but everybody watching, when she says things like, oh, we can't have another McGovern map, after 2016, looking at Bernie Sanders, thinking Bernie Sanders is a McGovern. Hillary Clinton had the McGovern map. Hillary Clinton had that McGovern map. but the God forbid they sit there and say, oh, maybe we went too far.
Mhm.
It's I don't know. I'm just of the belief I think it's an excuse. I don't think it's an actual rationale for why they do things.
Yeah, I think there's a desperation to win, right? And that's a big part of it. But there's also folks who like to be associated with corporate power, right? You know, it's an easier way to do politics than actually going out and grassroots organizing to just raise money. Now, I distinguish between the Clinton and the Obama years, and I think there are real differences there. But not that I don't have critique of both, but I think that Obama came into office, remember, in a time of incredible economic turbulence. And there may have been some policies and some strategies that weren't successful, right? But I do think that Obama himself, I would genuinely say, I think he intended and wanted to do more and to do it better. And then he ended up in that 2010 cycle losing power, right? And also, frankly, having a Democratic Party that was not functional. It really wasn't. And so I'm not trying to, and I know some people will disagree with me. I'm not trying to let Obama off the hook on everything, but I think that's very different than what Clinton did. Bill Clinton in the 90s came to power as a leader of the Democratic Leadership Council, as someone who was deeply committed to this vision of, literally saying the era of big government is over, literally saying, we are going to govern as a centrist, even center-right party in so many ways. And so I look back on that Clinton presidency, and I see it really as a presidency in which the Democratic Party broke with the New Deal in the most fundamental ways. And after that break, then everything that came after that became increasingly difficult, right? It was hard to keep the coalitions together at the state level and the local level. Congress became much more turbulent, keeping it, et cetera. And now the question is, some 30 years later, almost 30 years later, does Joe Biden, who was a product of that time, right, literally was in the thick of it and some of the more difficult and unpleasant aspects of it, does Joe Biden recognize that if he is indeed a loyal Democrat, right, his job is to jettison that baggage, to get rid of that, and to say, no, we're not going to do it that way anymore. That the Democratic Party will actually be about governing in a big fundamental way. And so today I wrote my piece for The Nation today was about Representative Jamal Bowman's response to Biden's speech. And the truth of the matter is, I thought Biden gave a very good speech.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I thought the most compelling statement made last night was that of Jamal Bowman. And his basic premise was that as everybody's saying Biden's going big, he's still not going big enough.
Right.
And that's the fundamentals of this moment. And that's, I guess, what I take away from all of this, all of our discussion, which I always enjoy having with you, Nomiki, because it's.
I feel the same.
But I think it's important because this taking apart these elements of our history and recognizing that long before Walter Mondale, there was a Philip Randolph, right? And throughout this whole thing, we're going to always find, touchstones of commitment on economic and social and racial justice. But now we also have this great pull of, kind of compromise politics. And we have a opening now, I think, to move away from that compromise politics. It is so vital that we listen to people like Jamal Bowman and that we don't simply let the pundits tell us, oh, Biden is now the most liberal president in American history, or something like that. Oh, but you watch.
Oh, I've seen it. I've seen it. The FDR commentary.
Exactly.
I spent a lot of time on that one.
I know, that's all I'm saying, and it's probably the place at which we close. But it is so very vital to understand that FDR wouldn't have been FDR if it hadn't been for the movements, and if it hadn't been for the pressure on him. And Johnson wouldn't have been Johnson if it hadn't been for the movements and the pressure on him. And Biden will not be Biden, the Biden that one would hope he might be, without the movements putting pressure on.
I think this,
fair housing and stuff.
As we close out, I think what's really important was you're saying is my takeaway from this speech was everything that he's been doing that we're surprised by how far he's gone is a reflection to the crisis, that there is no choice for many of these situations other than to respond to the crisis because, basically the curtain's been pulled back and you now realize, capital can actually go a little bit further because there's a crisis. You got to.
Yeah.
With that being said, it is now on the movements to pressure Biden, to pressure Schumer, to pressure Manchin, to pressure Sinema to do what's right in solving some of these, very fundamental institutional structural issues and much more. That's where we step in. That's where Jamal Bowman steps in, but that's where the movement step in. He's going to respond to the crisis.
Right. But it's also the movements is responding to the crisis. We're coming out of COVID. We've got plenty to respond to. 400 years of unaddressed racial injustice in this country. A climate crisis that is staring us in the face. We've got the real demands on us. So the crises are there, but also the movements have a ability to bring ideas to the fore.
That's right.
And one of the things that I would just close off on is saying that when you look at, for instance, Biden's infrastructure bill, what is in there? $400 billion for the caregivers, right?
Yeah.
And for a care economy. Biden did not wake up one morning and think, that was unions and grassroots activists, Ajahn Poo and others, putting that issue on the table for the last decade, and now it's there. Similarly, when Biden last night, he talked about the $50 minimum wage, right?
That one was a really...
But I know, and very frustrating because of the relief bill. But the fact that he felt a need to say that, right? Mm-hmm. That was because of movements. That was because movements had put that in that place. Same with the battle against gun violence. And so we have movements now that have tremendous ability to put the right ideas forward. And we have a moment that demands action. And I know you always call me an optimist, but I hold out the hope that combination of moment and movements might give us a presidency that we desperately need. And frankly, a Congress that we desperately need.
John Nichols, love having you on. Thanks for doing the work. Thanks for getting the weeds. Thanks for teaching us history. Really appreciate you.
I'm honored to be with you as always.
Thank you. All right, everybody, we will be back in literally 2 seconds because we don't have a lot of time. Once again, I'm going long. This is the week of me going long on the show. I'm just getting really great guests. That's what happens when you have great guests. We have Arun Chaudhary and Rep Rabb on. John, interview Rep Rabb. Oh, you missed him. Speaking of great leadership. All right, we'll be back in 2 seconds with our panel. They would fire me from cable news because I can't stick to a clock suddenly. I used to be so good at this, and now I'm just getting entranced. All right, we've got Arun Chaudhary, who is the host of the committee host of the committee program, and Rep Chris Rabb, straight out of Northwest Philadelphia. He is the representative of the 200th district of Pennsylvania's very corrupt legislature, but he is not. All right, real quick elevator pitch, because we got a big day on Monday because our pal here, Arun Chaudhary, is launching a show right here on our channel called The Committee Program, hence the committee program. Can you give us a little background, Arun? What is this, what are you doing? Is this a hijacking of our channel? Is this a coup?
Yes, it absolutely is. You will fly this channel to Cuba, please.
I'm down.
We would.
Can I
Look,
join?
we're just trying to finish where you're leaving off, which is sort of keeping the conversation going, but on a more global scale, looking at the progressive movement in Europe, in Latin America, and kind of trying to foster some of that global solidarity on the left that we see fomenting so effectively on the right. So it should be fun. Unlike your show, we will be recording bits and bobs all week and then putting it together on one Monday spectacular at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
For 3 hours, right? 3 hours. 10 p.m. in Europe for Europeans. 3 p.m. till 6 p.m., guys. That is a whammy. That is beautiful. So go check it out. You're already subscribed. Listen, okay. If you're watching the show and you haven't subscribed, okay, do it now. But also subscribe because now you get an extra show. This is very exciting.
There you go. I mean, look, you don't want to lose money on this whole thing.
You don't. We give you a great deal. Like, let me tell you, I know some shows that charge more on Patreon and you only get one a week. You get 4 on ours. And then you're going to go over to Runs and give him money too, because that's how socialism works. Okay. And meanwhile, we're fighting the algorithm gods. Guys, I just came back from Guatemala and I have a funny little story because this next clip is... So I was in Guatemala. I was reading the book Bitter Fruit. It's like a 40-year-old book. Go check it out. It's an amazing book about United Fruit Company. I'm like in it. I'm like, I had a transformative experience. I get to the airport. They did not accept my COVID test, even though I've been vaccinated. So they didn't accept my COVID test. And then they made me, basic story, they made me take another COVID test. It was like, they're like, you have 3 minutes to go 19 gates away to get to your airplane. So I'm like annoyed. I'm like, effing capitalism. I spent $300 on 2 COVID tests that I didn't even need because I'm vaccinated. I'm just like angry and I'm reading Bitter Fruit. And I'm like, this government's so corrupt. And this president here is a right-wing okay, get to the gate. And you're like, your flight is delayed. And then I'm like, what is going on at my gate? There's like hundreds of people and cameras everywhere. There's a press conference happening at my gate. And I look and I'm like, did they just say the president of Guatemala is here? So right in front of me was the president, the far right wing, speaking of international right wing leaders, who's probably worse than Trump, if you can believe it.
No pride.
Yeah. This Guatemalan president was right there in front of me. Now, let's flash forward to today's news. Kamala Harris, our vice president, has decided to step up into Arun territory and taking on the far right. Can we play this clip?
There are also long-standing issues that are often called the root causes of immigration. We are looking at the issue of poverty and the lack, therefore, of economic opportunities, the issue of extreme weather conditions and the lack of climate adaptation, as well as corruption and the lack of good governance, and violence against women, indigenous people, LGBTQ people, and Afro-descendants.
Okay.
The English language is just such a kick in the head sometimes, like just things happen, stuff's happening. We're not sure. Mistakes were made. Bombs were dropped.
Mistakes.
I don't, who dropped those bombs?
Who could even say anymore?
Who created a coup that unseated the leftist government that would have given Mayan people their farms again? Who did this, Rabb? Who do you think had? Listen, this leader is not a great guy, but I'm just very curious how Vice President Kamala Harris forgot like a big part of this equation. What would that equation be, Rabb? You're a student of history. You know your shit.
That's curious. So you're saying there's a connection between U.S. foreign policy and corrupt right-wing leaders and how that disrupts the global South and immigration patterns to the U.S. and the corporations who exploit their labor as undocumented? Is that what you're trying to suggest?
I would not in writing.
That's very conspiratorial, but I want to say something about that. Conspiracies can be true. In fact, conspiracies are often true. And there are conspiracies that have been documented that are now considered fact. So any notion around white supremacy, around police terror, all the things that have been now validated by corporate media in just a couple years, were put in the conspiracy theorist pool up until now. So for those
they
of us
found
who
the
are
Loch
saying
Ness
this,
monster living in the pool, and they're like, there it is. You can see it. Yeah.
there it is. There it is. So it's interesting that you're saying, well, if there's a piece left out of this political algorithm around all this stuff that's going down there, it's bad, without any connection to how dirty our hands are collectively. And that is problematic, right? That transcends political affiliation. In the corporate duopoly that is so unduly influential in all aspects of society. It is also an indictment of corporate media, because we have people talking about immigration in corporate media and talking about how bad the previous administration was, without talking about the Democratic complicity in these systems. And have not brought on a single Central American to discuss their own, on their own behalf.
Thank you. So that was when I was in, and I've talked about this in the show a bit. I did an opening on this a few weeks ago. If you guys want to go back and check it out, I met a guy who, the best part of my trip was I took a very long hike on Lago Atitlan in largest lake in Central America. And my guide was this man named Cesar Morales. He didn't speak any English. And he decided, because he was courageous and he literally intentionally wanted to tell me his story about how he had been to the United States once before. And he was, of course, put in 2.5 years ago into one of these border camps. And the story from his perspective was literally like 150 times worse than any of the stories I had read, because stuff that had not been illustrated were, let's say, they put shackles around his neck, his wrists, and his legs. There's so many elements of his story that were horrifying. To be able to get the $7 that they were going to give him from Guatemala City, it's like 6 hours away, to his town, to be able to get home, because that's something that they have to do when they send you back finally after they work you to death and put you in different, they put him in a workers' camp where they paid him to farm $1 a day. This is ICE. This is our government. So I'd never heard this before. And he's telling me detailed, literally, this is, and I went through, obviously I'm a reporter, so I asked him different elements of this. And I said, well, why do you want to tell me this? And he says, I don't think, just like I didn't know how bad it was at the border, I don't think you know how bad it is at the border. I'm like, no, we know it's pretty bad. He's like, I don't. And then I'm like, oh my God, you're right.
Turns out, yeah.
Turns out Cesar is right. Not to mention he had loans. He's going to be paying off these loans for 10 years for $1,400, by the way, $1,400 to pay the coyotes. Arun, this is something that you touch on all the time. How do you get away with this? How does Vice President Kamala Harris sit there knowing very well she's been briefed? Her dad was a Marxist.
Oh, she knows, she's heard, she knows all these things. That's not what it's about. And it's not, hey, listen, that's not what it's about. No, that's just, it's just almost a reflexive laziness. There is an interesting conversation to be had about queer rights in Latin America, for sure. The role the church has had, all these things, historical factors, how poverty plays into it. And there's a lot of things the U.S. can do about it. But this sort of self-reflexive thing to sort of be able to shame and yell at people who are poorer than you is just sort of emblematic of politics, bipartisan politics. I would even say, across many different demographics, the idea of just punching down and you're not a good enough parent and you don't do things right, and maybe you don't treat your gay people in your country right, because that's sort of the almost parochial way it's coming out. It's not coming out as a fundamental human civil rights issue. It's coming in of why are you feeding your kids fried chicken for breakfast kind of thing.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, that's so profound. Yeah.
And it makes me mad because it's backpedaling from where we were with Obama in a lot of ways. And certainly a lot of your audience, again, is going to have, huge bones to pick with Obama and Obama foreign policy, but kind of the apologizer in chief who ran. He ran on these things. We ought to have a conversation with Guatemala. We ought to tell Chile sorry, and maybe we did not, do those things as well as we could, but that was a conversation Democratic Party and mainstream elements of it were ready to have. Talk about Mossadegh, talk about Indonesia, talk about all of these places.
It's interesting you say that because obviously we're a big colonial country and we've had this patriarchal role over Guatemala and the global South. Her tone was that. Her tone was essentially what, the way the Republicans talk to poor people. That's how she was talking to the Guatemalans. And granted, their leader is a piece of shit, but it wasn't like this happened under his leadership. He's just the continuation of many, many years of this leadership. Chris, Rabb, sorry.
So that's
Respect,
infuriating.
Rabb.
No. Well, I just, people, it's a moniker that my mother has approved and I don't want to disappoint her. But I think that's the difference between a politician and a public servant. It's so easy to go after the low-hanging fruit and the symptom chasing. Oh, look what they're doing to their queer folk but you don't talk about the systemic issues, and you don't talk about your complicity. So I'm not going to say I've mastered it, but how I've gotten really good at this is when I talk about police terror, and I say, and it's dangerous work for me because I'm a Black man who drives, right, and lives in Philadelphia, where I'm as afraid of the cops as I am of, other folks who are, rocking the illegal guns. So I say this at great peril, but it's true. I'm not asking for a higher level of transparency and accountability than the one I accept when I became an elected official.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
People can find out damn near anything they want about me. They can find out what I'm doing every single day, how I voted, what legislation I've operated, I put forth, how much money I brought back to the district. All of that stuff is out there, publicly available to anyone on the planet. And yet we don't have that type of scrutiny or the opacity that protects all these other institutions. But I also acknowledge that I work, and you always say it at the beginning of your show, this segment, that I work in a really corrupt institution. I could be very offended by that and then say, oh, no, it's not. No, there are things that we could reform. And no, I'm saying I work in a cesspool. Yeah. If I don't acknowledge that I work in a cesspool, you can't trust me.
That's interesting.
You can't trust me. And I'm saying I'm working in a cesspool because I, as an elected official, I have to acknowledge that the cesspool exists and explain why it's so bad, how it hurts the average person, how it hurts my neighbor and constituent, and what we can do to transform it. You can't transform something you don't fully understand, right? And if you're, if this politician who is our vice president doesn't have the political will or courage to say, look, we are complicit. These are symptoms of imperialism and militarism and capitalism. And if she can't do that, and maybe that wasn't, there's a right moment for everything, but it should have happened long ago.
It's interesting. It's interesting you say something because obviously you have a reparations bill, but I'm thinking to myself, we are so, as a society, as an American, United States society, we are so allergic to dealing with our truths, the truth of the capitalist country that we live in a way that Germany, Arun, you live in Germany, was, forced to in a very harsh way.
Some call it an overcorrection, but yeah. We got a lot of
some say, or South Africa, or Truth and Reconciliation committees to, and there are questions.
Yeah, it's ugly, it's messy, it's family, it's what life is. Imagine the speech that was thrown out, where Kamala goes down there and has a messy conversation about our messy history in this continent that we all just found ourselves in at the expense of Native peoples. And just like, what a profoundly different moment that would be, where it's like, hey, we're your rich neighbor up north, but like we actually came to have a real talk about what to do, and not just the usual, not just the easiest.
What's so crazy about that, and I understand that maybe from their perspective, they're trying to mitigate or expose the rising far right, as you are, Arun, right? So there's an opportunity there, and it can be I don't know, diluted if she were to suddenly say, oh, by the way, as I'm talking to a Nazi, essentially is a Nazi. By the way, when the CIA and the FBI came down here and staged a coup and 500,000 people died, even though maybe if they just waited like 3 months later, the right wing would have risen up anyways. maybe when we did that, because all of our CIA people and FBI people were also on the board of United Fruit, who had big stakes, and it was all because of land reform, which was a very reformist issue. It wasn't even radical. Like maybe we shouldn't have done that. But like, if she were to talk about any of these truths, which these are well documented, like the son of the New York Times guy wrote the book. It's like not, this isn't like radical by any means at this point. And it's also, we're not doing that anymore. Like, that's the crazy part. It's not like we still have a stake in that business. There are other things that are happening in the global South, but we don't have a stake in that. So what I don't understand is, why not just say it? Why not just apologize? One line, leave the stage, go to an indigenous community, because it's Guatemala and very large indigenous population, Guatemala, Mayan population. Go and talk and go to farm. I don't know, just do something.
Because I think there is a reliance and a belief, and probably even, soupçon of truth sprinkled in there, to the idea that if America is perceived to be the thing we all want it to be, the thing we know it quite isn't but want it to be, that is soft power, and that is soft power that we can wield. But when we've seen diplomatic corps wield it effectively, and we're led to believe that right now we have the best of the best of the best, we know that actually talking past a leader and to the people of a country is a hell of a way to conduct diplomacy, and a hell of a way to move soft power around. And how great would it be? You talk tough and you're like, and now I want to talk to the Guatemalan people. And there's a lot that we share. And you can, I'm almost like wanting to write it right now. It's like jumping out. It's like so easy,
Oh man, Rabb, should we take a trip to Guatemala and you can speak to be like, listen, I'm on the same party as her. But that's also something that used to happen too. When leadership was not doing it, you had delegations of congressional members who go, and they still do that to an extent, but they would have big speeches and say, listen, my leader's not, but I am going to talk to you as a representative of the government. So Rabb, are we going to Guatemala? Are you going to talk?
Yeah, I'm down.
Let's do it.
And we have folks who are coming over in the farming community in Pennsylvania. It is a huge industry. There's a lot of undocumented folks from Central America. And who's speaking up for them for purely self-interested purposes are the farmers, where there is labor shortage. Right. And they're saying, I don't like how ICE is treating my workers who happen to be undocumented. And we want them to have access to driver's licenses so that they're not caught up in the system and ultimately deported. So you're having conservative local farmers on the right side of the issue for pure self-interest, right? We have to talk about how our histories and our fates are intertwined. We have to tell that story. And as Arun said, it ain't pretty, but it's okay, because as I promote my forthcoming reparations bill, I'm pushing against a lot of walls that have been put up, not based on facts, not based on personal injury, how it's going to hurt an individual, but because this mythology that people have embraced without any understanding of the histories that have that moving forward have hurt them as white people. And that's how you connect it to like the tipped minimum wage. If you're a QAnon loving single white mom in rural PA and you're earning $2.83 working at Denny's, and you can't make ends meet, and trying to feed your daughter, you need to know that tipped minimum wage is a legacy of slavery.
Exactly.
And that you are actually being victimized by white supremacy, as white as driven snow as you may be, and it impacts negatively everyone.
Because there's the economic model. The economic model of the time when TIP started was the labor force was slaves. And then it is expanded to not with racism, the intentions of racism, but just exploiting labor altogether.
Exploiting labor it started with enslaved labor.
That's right.
And it moved to those folks who are, the precariat, right? But who's telling I have found that when I've used this narrative, it's almost always the first time people have heard it. In almost any community I go to, and I can see lights go off. And it's not because I'm a genius, it's not because I'm the most eloquent, but if you tell the story and you reach people where they are and you're not shaming them, you're saying this is how we are impacted, and you understand and you make it about we and not us versus them, then you create an opportunity to learn and work together. And I'm not an optimist by nature, But I do know, having practiced this quite a bit now over the past 2 years around reparations, which is one of the most, touchy subjects there is. If I can do it here on that issue, we can do it on almost anything.
What do you think, Arun? Doable?
I think that's right. I think doable.
Cool. Consensus. Okay, so we have two things. Consensus on how we speak about really complicated issues that are have divided us since the beginning. And we're going to Guatemala again.
And we're going to Guatemala.
I'm a pro now. I know how to get there. And we're going to speak we're going to bring Cesar along because he's willing to speak, and he's willing to speak on camera, by the way, which is an amazing aspect of this. But he doesn't have Wi-Fi, so we need to get cameras there. So let's go talk to Cesar. I'm just going to brainstorm this out loud. And then Rep Rabb, as a representative of our country, an elected representative of our country. Listen, I don't have the big lobbying dollars. You might have to, well, I can't pay for you anyways, but actually I could. You're in Pennsylvania. What am I talking about?
That's right. Yeah.
I'll give you my car. Do you like, it's not my car anymore, but what do you feel about a 12-year-old Prius? Is that?
What is the value?
Dented. It's a little dented. It's not an Elon Musk Tesla.
Where does that get us on the lobbying market in Pennsylvania?
Right. No, it does not. But if it gives me to point A to B,
it'll get you a parking spot in Philly. That's all it'll get you.
It has a couple of Bernie stickers on it, kind of faded, a peace sticker on it, a no on Prop 8 sticker on it from like literally 11 years ago, 12 years ago. But great gas mileage. All right. So we're taking a trip to Guatemala. Stay tuned. This will be a great fundraiser to pay for everybody but Rep Rabb. And we promise that you will be speaking on behalf of the rest of the country that was frustrated with Kamala Harris's no pressure, no big deal. You do it all the time. It's just totally normal. All right, go check out the committee program Monday, 3 p.m. right here. 3 hours. We're going to disperse the show throughout the week, but you got to go check it out live because this is exciting. Arun is doing this. He's taken the show globally. And then maybe when we're doing live events again, because now we can go to Europe if you are vaccinated, we can do something in Europe. It'd be kind of a fun thing.
We could actually use the committee headquarters studio. It would be perfect.
Oh my God, so fancy. I just got a wall behind me.
There's nothing in the studio yet. Don't be too impressed, but we have the name. We've branded it.
I love it. All right. Adios. Hasta. See you next time. We got some shout outs, and I got to run because I got to go do an interview with somebody else because I'm doing this documentary. And it's so much stuff happening. Shout outs. All right. We got Pete from Oakland saying it's wild to see Vice President Harris admonish the president of Guatemala for, quote, root causes of migration without taking a single breath to acknowledge the involvement of her own government. Shameful. Agreed. I think we all agree. All round of applause. We agree. JR Dozer, thank you for the love. And Zach Sherman says, keep up the good work, Nomi. I may not always get to participate in the chat, but I do really like the show. Gracias. Thank you so much. Prairie Fire Kowalski, what is my favorite Greek food? Well, my mom's side of the family is from northern Greece, actually Albania, but a Greek village. They were known for pitas, like spanakopita, spinach pie, tiropita, cheese pie, but there were hundreds of them. Whatever your vegetable was that was growing in the garden or your meat that you just slaughtered that week, you turned it into a pita. And my grandmother used to do it by hand, and she was the best at it. First thing, I don't eat it that often, but I don't eat any of that frozen stuff. I have to eat it homemade. It has to be it's very rare I eat it anymore, but there's a lot of butter in it. A lot of, it's very thin, great. That's my favorite Greek food. So it's not really something that you can find unless you go to northern Greece and you find an old grandmother who knows how to make phyllo dough from scratch. But, if you ever get an opportunity to go to northern Greece and do that, that's the real pita. I also like dolmades, the dolmas. Shout outs. Harvey K is in the live chat, watching his friend John Nichols, watching me. What better than that? Thanks to Harvey K for joining us in the live chats, and huge thanks to all of our moderators on YouTube and Twitch for building those algorithms and keeping our spaces troll free. They're coming for us. We will see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you to Dorsey. Thank you to our whole team. Gotta run. Gotta wrap it up. I'm wearing a blazer today because I gotta go be professional and interview someone. So I will be back later. See you on tomorrow, Fem Friday. Tomorrow. See ya. 3 p.m. Stay in solidarity. Bye.
The Nomiki Show. Yeah. clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, faith fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show.